It's July 30th, 2026, and right now the United States military has more firepower staged around Iran than at any point since this war started back in late February. And yet, for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, the bombs stopped falling. That's not a typo. After 12 straight nights of CENTCOM strikes, after threats of the biggest attack the Pentagon has ever launched against a single country, after B-2s, B-1s, and B-52s flying round-trip missions that stretched past 30 hours in the air, the United States just went quiet. 3 days without a single strike. And the reason isn't that Iran suddenly backed down. It's that President Trump made a call over the weekend to pause the entire campaign and give diplomacy one more shot. So today, we're breaking down exactly how close the U.S. actually came to unleashing its biggest strike package yet, what's sitting on the table right now while the guns go silent, and why this pause might be the most dangerous moment of the entire war, not the safest one. Let's talk about what was actually building before this pause hit, because the scale of it is genuinely hard to overstate. Operation Epic Fury, the code name for the American bombing campaign against Iran, has now run more than 60 separate bomber missions. 18 of those missions involved full round-trip flights straight from the continental United States, meaning crews were airborne for over 30 hours at a stretch, refueling multiple times over open ocean just to reach Iranian airspace and get back. All three of America's strategic bombers, the B-1, the B-2, and the B-52, have been rotated through this operation, and according to the Air Force's top general, more than 13,000 individual targets inside Iran have been struck since the war began. 13,000 targets. Air defense systems, ballistic missile storage sites, one-way attack drone facilities, warships, naval mines, weapons production factories. A majority of Iran's military infrastructure, according to American officials, has been destroyed or severely degraded. And on top of the aircraft themselves, dozens of additional aerial refueling tankers have been pushed into the region, the kind of logistics buildup that only makes sense if you're planning to sustain a much heavier tempo of operations, not wind one down. And then there's Pickaxe Mountain, the name that's been hanging over this entire war for weeks now. It's a deeply buried facility carved into the Zagros Mountains, built next to the ruins of the Natanz nuclear complex that Operation Midnight Hammer destroyed back in June of last year. Iran has been excavating this site since 2020, and satellite analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies shows Iran has since surrounded the whole facility with security walls and expanded tunnel networks running west, east, and south. The Wall Street Journal reported that Israeli intelligence assessed Iran had moved centrifuges, the machines used to enrich uranium, into Pickaxe Mountain last fall. President Trump didn't deny that report when asked directly. He said Iran may have done exactly that, but that ultimately, in his words, it doesn't mean anything unless they have the material, because the U.S. is tracking the actual uranium stockpile itself. And that stockpile is not small. Iran is believed to be sitting on somewhere close to 1,000 pounds of highly enriched uranium, with the International Atomic Energy Agency's director confirming that roughly 200 kilograms of that material is believed to be stored in hardened tunnels near the destroyed Natanz site, likely inside Pickaxe Mountain itself. Trump had already called his shot publicly twice. First on the Hugh Hewitt radio show, saying the U.S. was watching Pickaxe Mountain closely, and that every time Iran shows activity there, the U.S. blows it up, so now Iran doesn't even like talking about it anymore. Then again from the Oval Office, telling reporters directly that the United States would be hitting that area pretty soon and very heavily, adding that there wasn't a damn thing Iran could do to stop it. That's not typical language for a sitting American president to use about a specific named target before a strike even happens. It's basically an operational warning delivered on live television, and it lined up with everything else moving into place. The B-2s, the tanker buildup, the tightening ring of CENTCOM operations hitting drone storage and command centers across 10 different Iranian cities, including Tehran, Tabriz, Bushehr, Bandar Abbas, and Chabahar. Every signal pointed toward Pickaxe Mountain being next. So what actually stopped it? Here's where the story takes a sharp turn. Trump told Axios directly that he made the decision to pause strikes on Iran over the weekend, specifically to give negotiations another chance. In his words, very deep talks are taking place with the Islamic Republic, and if they don't work out, the U.S. will go back to very strong military action. That's a real pause, not a lull in the news cycle. The U.S. held off attacking Iran for a third consecutive day, despite having spent the previous week openly threatening a major new attack. Whatever was building toward Pickaxe Mountain got put on hold at nearly the last possible moment. If you're following this war closely and you want to actually understand where it goes from here instead of just catching fragments of it, go ahead and hit subscribe and drop a like on this one, because the next 72 hours could genuinely decide whether this pause turns into a real off-ramp or just a brief reload before something much bigger happens. Now here's the part that should make you skeptical of how solid this pause actually is. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson came out and said, in no uncertain terms, that Iran currently has no negotiations taking place with the United States at all. The only official talks Tehran acknowledges are with Oman, and those are specifically about the future of the Strait of Hormuz. Not about the broader war, not about the nuclear program, not about Pickaxe Mountain. So you've got the American president publicly describing very deep talks happening with Iran, and you've got Iran's own government flatly denying that any negotiations with the US are happening right now. Those two statements cannot both be fully true. Either Trump is overselling the diplomatic progress to justify pausing a campaign that was about to escalate dramatically, or Iran is downplaying contact with Washington to avoid looking like they folded under pressure. Either way, the foundation this pause is sitting on looks a lot shakier than the headlines are making it sound. And the Strait of Hormuz situation hasn't actually resolved either, which matters enormously here because that choke point is what triggered the last 2 weeks of strikes in the first place. Before this war, roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply moved through that strait. Traffic through it right now remains negligible. Iranian state television reported that Tehran forced 6 ships attempting to transit the southern corridor near the Omani coast to turn around, just in the last few days, during the supposed pause. Iran has said explicitly there's no change to their policy on the strait, meaning they'll keep targeting commercial vessels that don't get permission before transiting. So even while the bombing has stopped, the actual economic standoff that started this entire escalation cycle hasn't budged an inch. As of this week, there were 24 tankers sitting and waiting at Iran's main loading port on Karg Island, up from 21 just the day before, according to maritime tracking firm Windward. That backlog is only growing, not shrinking, even during what's supposed to be a diplomatic reset. Let's talk about why this pause might actually be happening for reasons that have nothing to do with diplomacy at all, because American reporting has started raising a much less comfortable explanation. There are growing questions about pressure on U.S. stockpiles of Patriot interceptors and other defensive munitions after 2 straight weeks of sustained combat operations across multiple fronts simultaneously. Trump pushed back hard against that idea directly, telling the Wall Street Journal that the United States has far more munitions than anyone else in the world and far more than it actually needs. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz backed that up too, telling NBC's Meet the Press that he's personally verified, in his words, every which way, that the U.S. military has everything it needs to conduct this campaign as effectively as it needs to be conducted. Those are strong denials. But strong denials tend to show up precisely when a story is gaining traction. And the fact that both the president and his national security advisor felt the need to publicly shoot down a stockpile shortage narrative in the same week. The bombing campaign paused is worth sitting with for a second. Meanwhile, Iran hasn't been sitting still either, even during this so-called pause. On Friday, July 24th, drone strikes hit U.S. military facilities directly at Sheikh Issa Air Base in Bahrain, triggering air raid sirens across the island kingdom and explosions near the capital, Manama. Just this week, Saudi Arabia's defense ministry confirmed it intercepted multiple drones launched out of Iraq targeting petroleum facilities in the kingdom's oil-rich eastern province and near Riyadh. And Jordan's military shot down a drone that breached its airspace at dawn just today. So while the American side of this war has genuinely gone quiet, Iranian-linked strikes on regional targets have continued right through the pause, hitting Gulf allies, hitting oil infrastructure, hitting exactly the kind of targets that could easily drag the United States right back into an active bombing campaign the moment Washington decides enough is enough. That brings us to what's happening today in Washington, because this is where the next chapter of this war actually gets decided. And then there's the Zelensky meeting happening the same day, which connects back to something that's been quietly reshaping how people understand this entire conflict. Zelensky has publicly alleged that Russia has been feeding Iran satellite intelligence on American and Gulf military installations throughout the course of this war, specifically surveillance covering air bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. Whether that's genuine skepticism or strategic downplaying to avoid complicating today's diplomatic meetings is something we may not know for a while. But the fact that Zelensky is walking into the Oval Office the same day as Netanyahu, with both meetings touching on Iran in different ways, tells you how tangled this entire situation has become. One conversation is about whether to resume the biggest bombing campaign in this war's history. The other is about whether Russia is actively helping Iran survive it. It's worth understanding exactly what a resumed strike package would actually require to pull off successfully, because hitting Pickaxe Mountain was never going to be as simple as just sending B-2s in alone. Throughout this campaign, F-16 CJ Wild Weasel squadrons have been flying alongside the bombers, and their entire job is suppression of enemy air defenses, hunting for Iranian radar emissions, and feeding targeting data to anti-radiation missiles. before the radar operator on the ground even realizes he's been detected. 2 full squadrons worth of those aircraft have reportedly flowed into the region over the past 2 weeks, joining F-35s from multiple services flying top cover. That's the standard formula for any deep strike into contested airspace. Radar killers going in first to blind the defensive network, then the actual bomber package moving through the window that opens up. None of that happens on short notice either. Getting a full bomber wing, a wild weasel squadron, and every maintainer, fueler, and armorer needed to support them into theater is weeks of coordinated logistics, not a single phone call. Sealift can move the bulk of heavy equipment, but cargo ships crossing an ocean at 25 knots take weeks to arrive. So anything time-sensitive rides the airlift bridge instead, C-17s and C-5s running around the clock alongside the tanker fleet. All of that machinery has already been built up and positioned. It's sitting there right now, which is exactly why so many analysts were confident a strike on Pickaxe Mountain was imminent before this pause hit. But it's also worth being honest about what Iran still has left, because degraded is not the same thing as disarmed. Even after 13,000 targets struck, and a majority of Iran's military infrastructure reported destroyed or severely damaged, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps still fields a meaningful arsenal of ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and fast attack boats. Estimates suggest Iran started this conflict with somewhere around 5,000 ballistic missiles and has burned through a significant portion of that stockpile, but they're not empty-handed. And the same goes for their drone inventory, which started in the tens of thousands. The recent strikes on Bahrain, the intercepted drones targeting Saudi oil infrastructure, and the drone Jordan shot down this week all confirm that Iran's proxy and direct strike networks can still reach out and hit targets well outside its own borders, even while absorbing sustained losses at home. That's exactly why any resumed campaign would almost certainly need to keep targeting ballistic missile launchers and drone storage facilities in parallel with anything aimed at Pickaxe Mountain itself, because taking out the nuclear infrastructure without also degrading the delivery systems only solves half the problem. Let's get into the human cost here too, because it's easy to lose sight of that behind all the strategic maneuvering. Inside Iran, health ministry officials report that 59 people have been killed and 666 others injured since June 27th alone, in just the most recent wave of this conflict. On the American side, the Pentagon has confirmed at least 4 service members killed in the most recent escalation. Dignified transfers have taken place at Dover Air Force Base, President Trump personally saluting flag-draped transfer cases and telling grieving families that these were true heroes who ran toward danger and will never be forgotten. There's also been friction over how the Pentagon has handled disclosure of American casualties more broadly, with reports suggesting the Defense Department was slow to reveal the full scope of troop injuries sustained since the war began. Injuries officials say were intentionally held back initially to protect service members, though the vast majority, we're told, were minor concussions, and the overwhelming majority of those injured have already returned to duty. Now let's actually talk about what a resumed strike on Pickaxe Mountain would look like if talks collapse and Trump follows through on his warning to go back to very strong military action. The weapon of choice remains the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, a 30,000-pound precision-guided bunker buster capable of punching through roughly 200 feet of reinforced concrete before detonating. And the B-2 Spirit remains the only aircraft on Earth cleared to carry it operationally. 7 B-2s dropped 14 of those bombs on Fordo and Natanz during Operation Midnight Hammer back in June of last year, the longest B-2 combat mission since 2001. But experts assessing Pickaxe Mountain believe its tunnel complexes may sit under as much as 2,000 feet of granite, potentially placing the core facility beyond even the confirmed penetration depth of the existing bunker buster. That's exactly why the Air Force has been simultaneously fast-tracking the GBU-72, the next-generation penetrator designed to go even deeper, with alternative navigation systems built to keep functioning in GPS-contested environments. If this strike resumes, it likely won't be a repeat of Midnight Hammer. It'll be a step beyond it, engineered specifically to answer everything Iran has spent the last year building to survive the first round. Let's talk about the economic side of this pause too, because global energy markets have been watching this war just as closely as the Pentagon has. When word broke that strikes had actually stopped, oil prices tumbled on the news, traders reading the pause as a signal that the worst of the supply disruption risk might finally be easing after nearly 2 weeks of chaos around the Strait of Hormuz. Deutsche Bank analysts described it as a welcome pause from the main actors, but a fragile one, especially given the side battles still playing out elsewhere in the region. That fragility shows up clearly when you look at the Bab al-Mandeb Strait situation down in the Red Sea, where Iran's Houthi allies in Yemen have been threatening to blockade that separate choke point entirely. That's the alternate route ships use to get around the Arabian Peninsula whenever Hormuz becomes too dangerous to transit. And if the Houthis actually follow through on shutting that down too, you're looking at simultaneous disruption to both major Gulf and Red Sea export routes at the same time, something Deutsche Bank flagged as a real and growing risk on the table. So even with US bombs not falling for the moment, the underlying economic pressure that helped trigger this entire escalation cycle hasn't actually eased. It's just paused alongside the military campaign, and markets know it could snap back the moment either side decides the diplomatic window is closed. There's a reason Iran has been racing to reinforce that site so aggressively, and it comes directly from watching what happened to Fordow and Natanz. Iran studied the damage from those strikes closely, and the working assumption among analysts is that they've deliberately multiplied their vulnerabilities on purpose, building out dozens of ventilation shafts instead of just a handful, on the theory that the US simply doesn't have enough 30,000-pound bunker busters in its inventory to hit every single one. It's a numbers game as much as an engineering one, but the same structural weaknesses that made Fordow ultimately defeatable, exposed ventilation shafts, above-ground power and supply lines, open tunnel entrances, are still the same vulnerabilities analysts have identified at Pickaxe Mountain. Iran can multiply the number of entry points, but it can't eliminate the fundamental physics of needing air, power, and access to a facility buried that deep underground. Back in March, CENTCOM's commander revealed that Iranian missile attacks had dropped by roughly 90% following a wave of B-2 strikes that dropped dozens of 2,000-pound bombs specifically on buried ballistic missile launchers, and separately confirmed an Iranian drone carrier ship had been set ablaze after being hit. That kind of result is exactly why American officials keep pointing back to the bomber campaign as proof the strategy works. 90% fewer missile attacks is a massive shift in the threat picture, and it's part of why Trump has repeatedly framed the B-2 fleet in almost reverent terms, calling the bombers magnificent, and crediting them with what he's described as bringing peace to the Middle East for the first time in 3,000 years, a wildly optimistic claim considering the war was still actively raging 5 months after he said it. But it does explain the administration's underlying confidence that if talks collapse and the bombers go back to work, the results will look a lot like what happened after Midnight Hammer, a sharp, measurable drop in Iran's ability to strike back, even if it doesn't fully end the underlying nuclear threat sitting under Pickaxe Mountain. If any of this is new information to you, or if it's helping you actually connect the dots between what's happening in the region right now and where this could be heading, drop a comment and let me know what you think comes next, because I genuinely want to hear whether you think this pause holds or whether we're just watching the calm before Pickaxe Mountain finally gets hit. Let's talk strategy for a second, because the stated American objective in this war has never wavered, even as the tactics around it have shifted constantly. From the very beginning, the goal has been that Iran simply cannot have a nuclear weapon. Full stop. Not a reduced program, not increased inspections, an actual end to the capability itself. Operation Midnight Hammer was supposed to be the answer to that problem back in June of last year. Instead, we're sitting here more than a year later, still talking about roughly 200 kilograms of highly enriched uranium believed to have survived those original strikes, now potentially sheltered inside an even more heavily fortified facility that didn't exist in its current form when Midnight Hammer happened. That's the core tension driving every decision being made in Washington right now. If you believe negotiations can genuinely eliminate that remaining uranium stockpile and permanently shut down Iran's ability to rebuild, then pausing strikes to let diplomacy work makes sense. But if you believe Iran is simply using this pause the same way it's used every previous ceasefire and interim agreement throughout this war, as a window to reconstitute, rebuild, and buy time until American political will fades, then every day this pause continues is a day Pickaxe Mountain gets a little more finished and a little harder to fully destroy when the bombs eventually do come. And there's a real argument that Iran's own recent behavior supports the second interpretation more than the first. This is a regime that signed onto interim agreements before, and then continued construction activity in direct violation of its own commitments almost immediately afterward. Satellite imagery analysis from the Institute for Science and International Security has previously shown continued vehicle activity and hardening operations at Pickaxe Mountain, even during periods when Iran publicly insisted there was nothing to see there. So when Iran's foreign ministry says today that there are no negotiations happening with the United States, while simultaneously continuing drone strikes on Gulf allies and refusing to change its posture on the Strait of Hormuz, that pattern lines up uncomfortably well with a regime buying time rather than one genuinely seeking an off-ramp. At the same time, it's worth being fair to the other side of this too, because a full resumption of strikes carries real risk beyond just the immediate military calculus. Every additional night of bombing deepens American troop exposure across a region where Iranian-backed proxies have already demonstrated the ability to strike U.S. bases directly, as we saw with the Bahrain attack on Sheikh Issa Air Base. It keeps the Strait of Hormuz choke point destabilized, which matters enormously to global oil markets, evidenced by oil prices actually tumbling this week, specifically because the pause gave traders some confidence that supply disruptions might ease. And it risks pulling in exactly the kind of wider regional escalation that Houthi threats against the Bab al-Mandeb Strait down in the Red Sea represent. A second potential choke point that could compound the economic fallout of Hormuz remaining unstable. So, whichever direction Trump leans after today's meetings with Netanyahu and Zelensky, there's no version of this where the decision comes without significant cost attached. There's also a strange, almost symbolic backdrop to today's meetings that's worth mentioning, because both Netanyahu and Zelensky are in Washington not just for policy talks, but to attend the funeral of the late Senator Lindsey Graham, one of Trump's closest allies in the Senate, and a hawkish voice who spent years pushing for exactly the kind of aggressive posture toward Iran that this administration eventually adopted. Graham was also someone who consistently pressed Trump to provide deeper support for Ukraine's war against Russia, which makes it almost fitting, in a grim way, that the two leaders most affected by those positions are standing in the same room in Washington on the same day these two conflicts are both hitting critical turning points. Netanyahu has openly called Graham one of Israel's greatest friends. It's the kind of moment that tends to shape informal conversations just as much as the formal meetings scheduled around it. And it's a reminder that a lot of the momentum behind America's posture in this war didn't come from the Pentagon alone. It came from a specific circle of political allies who spent years building the case for exactly this kind of confrontation. Zooming out even further, it's worth remembering that this entire war didn't start in a vacuum either. Hostilities between the US, Israel, and Iran broke out in late February of this year, when joint missile strikes hit multiple locations across Iran, with Trump stating at the time that part of the goal was encouraging regime change from within. Iranians taking over their own government, alongside the more explicit objective of ending Iran's nuclear program entirely. That framing matters here, because if regime change was ever a real objective sitting alongside the narrower nuclear goal, then a negotiated pause that leaves the current government in Tehran intact, even a weakened and heavily degraded one, represents a significant retreat from where American ambitions started 5 months ago. Iran, for its part, has continued launching retaliatory strikes against Israel throughout this year, including an attack back in early March that hit a residential neighborhood and killed 9 Israeli civilians. A reminder that whatever restraint is being shown this week didn't define how this war has actually been fought on either side. Here's the honest read on where things stand heading into these White House meetings. The American military has never been more staged and ready to deliver the single largest strike package of this entire war. 60-plus bomber missions, 13,000 targets already hit, dozens of tankers positioned, the next-generation GBU-72 penetrator being fast-tracked specifically for a facility like Pickaxe Mountain. Every piece of hardware needed for that biggest strike yet is sitting in the region right now, ready to move the moment the order comes down. What's standing between that capability and actually pulling the trigger isn't logistics anymore. It's a diplomatic gamble that both sides describe in completely contradictory terms. One side calling it very deep talks, the other side calling it no negotiations at all. That gap between what Washington is saying publicly and what Tehran is willing to admit is exactly the kind of uncertainty that tends to resolve itself suddenly, one direction or the other, once leaders sit down face to face and actually have to commit to a path forward. And today, with Netanyahu pressing for continued pressure and Zelensky raising uncomfortable questions about Russia's role in propping Iran up, Trump is about to have exactly those conversations. And it's not just Washington, Tehran, and Jerusalem watching how this plays out. Gulf allies like Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia have all absorbed direct or indirect hits over the past 2 weeks simply for hosting American infrastructure or sitting along Iran's retaliatory flight paths. And every one of those countries has a direct stake in whether this pause becomes permanent or whether it's just a brief reset before the campaign resumes even harder. Their air defense networks have been actively engaged this week, intercepting drones, sounding sirens, tracking incoming threats in real time, all while their own governments have no real say in whether Washington and Tehran actually reach an agreement. That's the uncomfortable reality sitting underneath every headline about deep talks and diplomatic space. The countries most exposed to what happens next aren't the ones making the decision. So where does this actually go from here? Does the pause hold long enough for real negotiations to materialize? Or does Iran's continued drone activity against Gulf allies give Washington the justification it needs to resume strikes even heavier than before? Does Netanyahu manage to push Trump back toward finishing what Operation Midnight Hammer started at Pickaxe Mountain? Or does the political pressure to avoid deeper Middle East entanglement win out instead? Let me know what you think happens next in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear where you think this goes. And if this breakdown helped make sense of everything that's been building toward this moment, share it with someone who's been following the headlines but might have missed just how close this entire war came to its biggest escalation yet. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes out of today's meetings, because depending on how those conversations go, we could be back to talking about Pickaxe Mountain by the end of the week. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.